The desert did not look dangerous that morning. It looked endless, yes, dry, yes, quiet in a way that made a person feel small, yes, but not dangerous, not yet. 9 wagons moved slowly across the pale, open land, their wooden wheels groaning in tired rhythm, pulled by horses with dust on their flanks and foam on their bits. The sky stretched wide and empty above them, a hard blue bowl with no clouds and no mercy. The wind moved like a whisper through the dry grass, carrying heat, sand, and the faint smell of sage. Every person in that wagon train wore 1800s Wild West clothing, long cotton dresses faded by sun and washing, leather boots worn at the heel, wide-brimmed hats, vests, suspenders, work shirts, and dusters. The women's dresses were loose at the waist, some tied with simple ribbons, some patched at the elbows, all practical, all made for travel and hard days. Their hair was pinned up beneath bonnets or tied back with cloth, but the wind kept pulling strands loose. They had been traveling for weeks. They were supposed to reach the next settlement in 5 days. They never did. The man rode slightly behind the last wagon, as he often did, his eyes moving across the horizon in slow, careful sweeps. He was not old, but the sun and life had already carved lines beside his eyes. He wore a weathered hat, a dark vest over a dust-covered shirt, a revolver at his hip, and a rifle tied to his saddle. He was the kind of man who didn't talk unless there was something worth saying, and because of that, when he did speak, people listened. He had joined the wagon train 2 weeks earlier, hired to help guide them through the desert trails and rough country. A quiet man, a capable one, the kind who fixed a broken wheel without being asked and stood the late watch without complaining. That morning he felt something was wrong, though he could not yet see what it was. He rode forward, his horse stepping carefully over rock and dry earth, until he reached the side of the lead wagon. "We should stop early today," he said. The driver, an older man with a gray beard and a limp, glanced down at him. "We're making good time." The rider looked out toward the horizon again, storm coming. The older man squinted, "Sky's clear." "Not that kind," the rider said quietly. The older man studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "All right, we stopped by sundown." But they never made it to sundown. It happened fast. Too fast. The land began to change first. The flat desert floor became uneven, then dipped into low hills and dry gullies. The trail narrowed, forcing the wagons into a longer line. Rocks rose on either side in broken ridges, like the bones of the earth pushing up through the sand. The rider didn't like it. He moved up and down the line, telling them to keep close, to keep moving, not to let too much space open between wagons. The women stayed mostly quiet, holding onto the sides of the wagons as they rolled over rough ground. All 9 of them were pregnant, some just beginning to show, others heavy with child, their movements slow and careful. They were sisters, cousins, wives, widows, bound for a new settlement where land was cheap and life was supposed to be kinder. One of them, a young woman with a pale blue dress stretched over her growing belly, called down from a wagon, "Is something wrong?" The rider looked up at her, then at the others who were listening without pretending not to. "Just bad ground," he said, "we'll be through soon." But he rested his hand on the butt of his revolver after he said it. They entered the narrow pass just after midday. The air felt different there, still heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Then came the sound. A crack, then another. Gunfire. The first bullet struck the lead wagon driver, throwing him backward off the seat and into the dust before anyone even understood what was happening. Horses screamed, rearing and pulling against their harness. Another shot shattered a wagon wheel. Someone shouted, someone else started praying. "Get down," the rider yelled, pulling his rifle free. Shots echoed from the rocks above them, bandits. They had been watching, waiting for the wagons to enter the narrow pass where there was nowhere to run. Men who had been walking beside the wagons tried to fire back, but they were exposed, and the shooters were hidden among the rocks. Within minutes, the fight was over before it had really begun. The bandits rode down from the rocks with their faces covered in cloth and their guns still smoking. They took the horses, the food, the water barrels, the ammunition, anything useful. One of them tried to climb into a wagon, but when he saw the women inside, saw their bellies, he swore and jumped back down. "Leave 'em," he said, "they won't last a week out here anyway." They took the last of the horses and rode away in a cloud of dust, leaving the wagons broken, the supplies gone, and the desert stretching in every direction like an ocean of sand and stone. The silence afterward was worse than the gunfire. No one spoke for a long time. The rider walked through the wreckage slowly, checking the wounded, closing the eyes of the dead, gathering what little the bandits had left behind, some tools, a few blankets, a small sack of flour they had missed, a dented coffee pot, 2 shovels, a hammer, a coil of rope. Not much. Not enough. The women sat together in the shade of a damaged wagon, their faces pale, their hands resting on their stomachs as if they were trying to shield the lives inside them from what had just happened. One of them finally asked the question none of them wanted to say out loud. What do we do now? The rider looked out at the desert, then back at the broken wagons, then at the 9 frightened women in their dust-covered 1800s dresses, their bonnets, their tired eyes. He knew the truth. They were too far from the last town to walk, too far from the next settlement to hope. Too few supplies. No horses. 9 pregnant women who could not travel fast, could not travel far. If they tried to walk, they would die in the desert. All of them. He was quiet for a long moment, thinking, measuring the sun, the land, the broken wagons, the tools, the scraps, the shape of the hills, the direction of the wind. Then he said the words that would change all of their lives. We don't walk. They looked at him, not understanding. He rested his hand on the side of the broken wagon and looked out over the empty land again. We stay, he said. We build, we find water, we make this place hold us instead of kill us. One of the women whispered, build what? He looked at the scattered wood, the broken wheels, the canvas covers, the tools, the rope, the hills that could block wind, the dry gully that might, if they were lucky, hide water deep underground. His voice was calm when he answered, a place to live. The wind moved through the pass, lifting dust and loose strands of hair, tugging at the edges of bonnets and skirts. Behind them, the trail disappeared into the rocks. Ahead of them, there was nothing but desert. And that was the day the wagons vanished from the world, and the day a man and 9 pregnant women in their 1800s Wild West clothing began a story no one would believe 9 years later. The first thing he built was not a house. It was a shade. The desert sun was a cruel thing, and he knew that before they could think about walls or roofs or anything that looked like a town, they needed a place where the women could sit without the sun draining the life out of them. Using broken wagon bows, torn canvas, and rope, he built a long, low shelter stretched between 2 half-buried wagons. It was not pretty, but it cast a wide shadow across the sand, and in the desert, shade was sometimes the difference between living and dying. All of them still wore their 1800s Wild West clothing, long work dresses, aprons, shawls, bonnets, boots covered in dust. The man still wore his worn hat, vest, and revolver, though now the gun was less for fighting men and more for hunting anything that moved. The second thing he looked for was water. Without water, nothing else mattered. He studied the land for 2 days, walking miles in slow circles, looking at the way the dipped where certain plants grew, where the soil felt slightly cooler under his boots. On the third day, he stopped in a dry gully where the ground was cracked but not dead. There were thin green reeds there, weak but alive. That meant water was somewhere below. He came back to the camp and picked up a shovel. I'm going to dig, he said. One of the women, older than the others with tired but steady eyes, said, that ground is hard as stone. He nodded, water's always hiding where it's hardest to reach. He dug alone the first day. The ground was packed clay and rock, and every inch felt like a fight. The sun burned his neck and shoulders, and dust filled his mouth and nose. By evening, the hole was only as deep as his knee. The next morning, when he walked back to the gully, he found 2 of the women there already. They had brought the second shovel. You shouldn't be doing this alone, one of them said quietly. You shouldn't be digging at all, he answered, looking at their swollen bellies. They looked at the hole, then at him. We're not dying sitting down, the older one said. So they dug. They worked in turns, slow and careful. The women could not dig for long, but they carried loose dirt away in buckets, cleared rocks, brought cloth to wrap around his hands when the skin split and bled. Day after day, the hole grew deeper. On the 6th day, the shovel struck mud. Not water, just mud. But mud meant they were close. He dropped to his knees and started digging with his hands, pulling up wet earth, his fingers shaking with exhaustion and hope. Then slowly, dark water began to seep into the bottom of the hole, filling the small space between the rocks. No one spoke. They just stared as the water slowly rose, inch by inch, turning the bottom of the hole into a shallow, muddy pool. One of the women began to cry quietly, her hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking. It wasn't much water, but it was enough. They lined the hole with rocks and wood to keep it from collapsing, and over the next days the small muddy pool became a well, shallow but steady. They boiled the water in the dented coffee pot in every container they had left, and for the first time since the attack, they drank without counting every swallow. Water meant they could stay, and staying meant they might live. Building shelter came next. The nights in the desert were cold, and winter was coming. Using wagon boards, broken wheels, canvas, rope, and mud from near the well, he began building small one-room shelters half dug into the ground, with low roofs and thick walls packed with earth to keep out wind and cold. He showed the women how to mix mud and sand and dry grass to make a kind of rough adobe. He showed them how to set boards at an angle so a roof would not collapse. He showed them how to dig a small trench around each shelter so that if rare rain came, the water would run around the homes instead of through them. They worked like that for weeks, slowly, painfully, but together. By the time the first cold wind came down from the north, they had built 5 small shelters and a larger one they used as a cookhouse and meeting place. Smoke from their small fire curled into the cold air each evening, thin but stubborn, like a signal to the world that they were still alive. The first baby came on a night filled with wind. The mother was young and the labor was long. They had no doctor, no proper bed, no medicine except boiled water, clean cloth, and steady hands. The women worked together, their sleeves rolled up, their hair tied back, their 1800s dresses covered with aprons and shawls as they moved back and forth between fire and bed. The man stayed outside. He walked back and forth in the cold, his boots crunching on hard ground, his hat pulled low, his hands opening and closing like he needed to fix something but didn't know what. Just before dawn, a baby cried. A thin, sharp sound that cut through the wind and the long night. The door opened and one of the older women stepped out, tired but smiling. "A girl," she said. He nodded once, but his eyes looked past her into the small shelter where the new mother lay, exhausted, holding a tiny, wrapped bundle against her chest. "Are they all right?" he asked. "They're alive," the woman said. "That's more than we had yesterday." He looked out at the desert as the sun began to rise, pale and cold over the empty land. That was the first child born in that place. She would not be the last. Winter settled over them like a long, quiet test. Food was never enough. He hunted small animals, rabbits, birds, anything he could find. The women learned to gather dry plants, roots, and seeds that could be ground into a rough kind of flour. They stretched every meal, made soup from bones, made bread so thin you could almost see through it. But no one starved. No one froze. And no one was left alone. At night they all gathered in the larger shelter, sitting close to the fire, the women sewing, mending clothes, wrapping blankets for the bobbies who began to arrive one by one over the winter months. The man fixed tools, carved wooden handles, repaired boots, and sometimes, when the bobbies cried and the mothers were too tired to stand, he walked the floor with a small bundle in his arms, rocking slowly until the child fell asleep. He spoke little, but the children stopped crying when he held them. One night, when the wind was loud outside and the fire burned low, one of the women asked the question that had been living in all of them for months. "Do you think anyone is looking for us?" The room grew quiet. The man stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. Some of the women looked down, one of them wiped her eyes. Another asked softly, "Then what are we supposed to do, just live here forever?" He lifted his eyes from the fire and looked at all of them, the tired faces, the swollen bellies, the small bobbies sleeping in wooden boxes lined with cloth, the women in their worn 1800s dresses and shawls, far from any town, any church, any road. His voice was calm, but there was something unbreakable in it. "We don't wait to be saved," he said, "we save ourselves." They were quiet, listening. "I give you my word," he continued. "As long as I'm breathing, no one here dies if I can stop it. Not you, not the children. I'll build what we need. I'll find what we need. I don't care how long it takes." One of the women whispered, "Why would you do that for us?" He thought about that for a long moment, staring into the fire, the light flickering across his tired face. Then he said very quietly, "Because you're not dying out here, not while I'm still standing." That was the promise he made that winter. A promise made in a small mud shelter to 9 women and a growing number of children, all dressed in their worn 1800s Wild West clothing, sitting around a small fire in the middle of a desert that did not care if they lived or died. But after that night, they were no longer just a group of stranded people. They were something else. They were a place. And the man who had been a stranger only months before became something none of them had expected when they first saw him riding behind their wagons on the open trail. He became the man they trusted with their lives. The desert did not soften with time. It remained sharp, dry, and merciless, but the people who lived there changed the way it felt. What had been a barren stretch of sand and rock became something else entirely. They built with what the desert offered and what little they brought with them. Broken wagon boards became walls, mud mixed with straw became bricks, rocks stacked carefully became chimneys and hearths. The man led the work, teaching the women and children to carve, pound, and shape the materials until they could stand on their own, sturdy against wind and sun. Each shelter became a home. Each home became a part of a growing village. The children ran between buildings barefoot, their laughter carrying across the still desert like a sound that had no right to exist in a place so harsh. They were all born in those first years, 9 women giving life to 14 children, then 16, then 18. The man learned to carry them all at once if needed, rocking them until sleep took them, singing softly in a voice the desert had never heard. All of them, children and mothers alike, wore the practical attire of the frontier. Rough cotton dresses, patched skirts, leather boots, aprons over clothing stained with dust and mud, shawls thrown over shoulders to shield from wind. He wore his long duster over trousers and boots, the brim of his hat forever shadowing his face as he worked. Water was still their lifeline. After the first shallow well, he had found a deeper one hidden beneath the desert floor, a secret vein of life that he expanded and fortified with rocks and wooden supports. They built a small irrigation channel from it so gardens could thrive. They grew beans, corn, and squash, coaxing green life from dry soil with hands that cracked and bled from work. The women, once strangers to farming, now moved like shadows through the small fields, knowing which seeds to plant, when to water, when to guard against the wind that could undo weeks of labor in a single gust. They built a schoolhouse next, a single room with low windows and a sloping roof of boards and mud, but inside it held everything a growing town needed: benches, a chalkboard carved from smooth wood, shelves of tattered books scavenged from their wagons or left behind by travelers. The children learned there reading, writing, arithmetic, sometimes by the firelight of a small lamp when the desert wind howled outside. The man, though he had no schooling himself, taught the older children to hunt and track, to carve wood and set traps, to understand the land in ways no city could ever teach. They built fences to protect against coyotes, wolves, and the occasional wandering bandit. They dug small pens for goats and chickens, learned to milk, to butcher, to smoke meat. Each day was measured, disciplined, and yet full of life. The desert that had once threatened to kill them now became a canvas. Every stone they stacked, every wall they built, every garden they planted was an assertion that they would not die here. They were not surviving anymore, they were living. The man, ever quiet, rarely spoke except when it mattered. But when he did, the words shaped more than behavior, they shaped hope. He taught the women to fire a rifle, to defend themselves, to recognize danger before it arrived. He organized patrols along the outer reaches of their little town, teaching the older boys to track, to read the land like a book. Nights were still cold, and winds could rip the breath from your lungs if you weren't careful, but the town burned fires that could be seen from miles, signals to any traveler that life still persisted here. Over the years, the settlement grew larger than anyone would have believed possible. By the fifth year, there were nearly 40 people: the man, the 9 women, and their growing children, all moving like parts of a living organism, all contributing to a single purpose: survival transformed into creation. They painted signs on wooden boards: well, cookhouse, school, children's yard, as if reminding themselves that they were more than desert scavengers, they were a community. They named no streets, no buildings, yet every person knew every corner, every well, every hidden cache. They had built from dust a place that could stand against the desert's cruelty. Winter came every year with bitter winds, but the town was prepared. The shelters were fortified, the animals safe, the children clothed in layers of cloth sewn and patched by the women's patient hands. Pregnancies continued, one after another, each new life a small miracle that the desert had no right to allow. The man was there for every birth, holding blankets, boiling water, or simply watching with steady eyes, ensuring that mothers and bobbies survived. His promise, made in the first winter, had not wavered. No one in this little town would perish if he could stop it. By the 9th year, the settlement had become something almost unrecognizable. From afar, it looked like a cluster of dust-colored buildings scattered among the hills. Up close, it was a town with streets cleared of stone, fences that marked homes, gardens thriving despite the sun, chimneys sending smoke into the clear desert air. Children ran barefoot between homes, their laughter mingling with the sounds of animals, the hammering of tools, and the low voices of mothers tending to cooking fires. The women moved like shadows across their gardens and homes, their 1800s dresses patched and faded, their hair tied back under worn bonnets, carrying the strength of 9 years of endurance in their every gesture. The man moved through it all like a quiet river, guiding, protecting, building. In 9 years, he had transformed the desert from an empty, lifeless expanse into a sanctuary, a fortress, and a home. He had taken 9 pregnant women and turned their fear into a future, their despair into determination, their survival into history. And all the while, the desert waited, as it always did, for it to see if life could truly take hold where it had once refused to linger. The sun rose low over the desert, painting the hills in gold and pink, casting long shadows across the small town that had once been nothing more than broken wagons and dust. The air was dry and still, but it carried a sound that had not been there for years: wheels on rough terrain, the distant clatter of horses, and voices that belonged to people from another world entirely. Outsiders were coming, and they expected what exactly? Bones, a few desperate survivors. The story of 9 women and 1 man stranded in the desert for 9 years was already whispered in nearby towns, dismissed as madness. When the riders crested the last ridge, the settlement revealed itself. From a distance, it looked like scattered huts, dust-colored and blending with the sand. But as they drew closer, the truth became impossible to ignore. There were fences neatly stacked and reinforced, gardens flourishing in patches of green, smoke curling from chimneys into the clear sky. Children ran barefoot through cleared paths, laughing, chasing chickens and goats. Women in worn but sturdy 1800s Wild West dresses carried water, prepared meals over open fires, tended to the animals, and tended to the fields. And at the center of it all moved a man who seemed carved from the desert itself, steady, calm, eyes scanning the horizon, hands strong from work, hat low over his face. The lead rider, a man from the nearest town, slowed his horse and whispered to his companion, "There's life here, real life. I didn't think anyone could survive out here, let alone build this." The first contact was cautious. The outsiders approached the perimeter slowly, hands visible, hats off in respect. The man stepped forward, as he always did, unarmed for now, only carrying the authority of decades of endurance. The women came forward behind him, their hands brushing over the children who followed silently. Each woman carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had faced death and refused to bend. Who are you?" one of the riders finally asked, awe creeping into his voice. The man's reply was simple, calm, and almost matter of fact. "We are the people who refuse to die here." The outsiders looked around, taking in the homes, the gardens, the small schoolhouse with children reciting lessons, the fences protecting the livestock, and the thriving community in the middle of a place they had assumed could not sustain life. Their mouths went dry. They had expected ruins. They had expected despair. Instead, they found a settlement alive with order, hope, and ingenuity. The women began to tell their story slowly, quietly, how they had been left with nothing but dust and broken wagons, how the man had promised to keep them alive, how each winter, each drought, each attack from wild animals had been met with endurance, skill, and courage. They spoke of children born in the shelters, of crops coaxed from sand, of a town built with hands that had once only known fear. Their voices were strong, their eyes steady, as they recounted 9 years of survival, love, labor, and determination. And the world listened. Soon the word spread. Newsmen, travelers, and historians came, unable to believe what they saw. Accounts were written, sketches made, photographs taken. The desert town became a symbol not of desolation but of what human will could achieve. The man who had once been a quiet guide now stood as the founder of a miracle that no one could have imagined. Children ran freely through streets with names they had never heard, mothers tended gardens that were once dust, and the women who had carried life into the world while surrounded by death were celebrated as pioneers in their own right. And in the center of it all, the man who had made the promise in the first winter looked around quietly, satisfied. He had done what he had vowed. No one under his care had perished. They had built a town, a future, and a legacy out of a desert that had meant to destroy them. By the time the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting the town in shades of orange and gold, the outsiders left, carrying stories that would spread across the territories. They had witnessed history in motion, a man, 9 women, dozens of children, and a thriving settlement in the heart of a desert that had once been deemed uninhabitable. And in the quiet that followed, the desert no longer seemed cruel. It had been tamed, transformed, and made to serve life, and those who had lived there knew without doubt that they had done something extraordinary. They had made history.